I think they're the ones that should be creating our strategic plans in our school systems, the doers, right?
Yes.
And so when you represent the expectation that, hey, like I said before, if you're a great leader and you can feel comfortable with saying, I don't know, right, to a group like that, but I'm sure you guys will figure it out. How can we get there together? You're actually moving leadership onto them, right? That's that transformational leadership that's really important. When teachers become those leaders, right, now we've got, what'll end up happening is that you'll see cognitive investment, right? That's the rationale. This is some great work out of Anthony Muhammad and Louise Cruz, right? Time for change.
You are listening to the Global CTE Podcast with your host, Sylvester Chisom.
Welcome to another episode of the Global CTE Podcast. I am your host, Sylvester Chisom. This is the place where we like to wrap a blanket of goodwill around our career tech education community, where I interview the best, the brightest, the movers, the shakers, the innovators, the people who are really making a difference and making an innovative impact on our education system. Today is no different. Coming to us from Wisconsin, I have my good friend, Scott Carr. Now, let me tell you about Scott. Scott is the Career, Community, and Life Readiness Consultant at CESA 2 in Wisconsin. This is one of the 12 CESA agencies that support school districts. With over 30 years of experience, Scott has dedicated his career to helping schools reimagine and redefine their educational systems to focus on career and community readiness. Growing up in a small town in Wisconsin, Scott was the youngest of three boys and found his purpose later in life, inspired by his own children's educational journeys. He holds degrees in education and leadership and has made significant contributions to various school districts and collaborative educational service agencies, particularly in the areas of special education, career readiness, and community engagement. Scott, welcome to the podcast, my friend.
Hey, thanks. Thanks for having me, man. I'm a big fan, Sylvester. Love what you're doing.
Oh, man. Yeah, I'm really excited about the work that you're doing. I was excited about having you on the pod, especially as, the work you're doing around mindset and how important that is to making the changes that we're looking for in our education system. So let's jump into it, man. I mentioned a little in the bio, but what's the origin story? How did you get here?
Well, I definitely have to kind of go back to my years in school because it has a lot of relevance to the work that I'm doing right now. I was the youngest of three boys, like you mentioned, grew up in a small town in Wisconsin, and, having two older brothers do very well in school, go on to college, and as I went through the educational system, I couldn't see its purpose, right? I couldn't see much relevance in it, and I kind of struggled. Probably finished in the bottom 50% of my class, I'm guessing. And when I graduated, my dad, over the road truck driver for about 60 years. My mom, stay-at-home mom, a waitress. My dad said, "Hey," he says, "you're either going to go to college or you're going to drive a truck." And so I'm like, okay, I didn't like the idea of driving a truck, though at this point right now, I do have a CDL license, mind you, a great skill to have, something to fall back on. But I thought, well, okay, I guess I better go on to college, right? And this is back in the 80s where it was, either college or you're going to do some type of like a skilled trade or drive a truck, right? And so luckily I was able to play a sport in college. Both my brothers played football. I ended up playing college football. So I was able to get into college, make it through. Probably, luckily, playing a sport got me through, and I was able to graduate. Right, so I left college still not really knowing my purpose, not really knowing what I want to do. I ended up with an education degree, a degree in Phi Ed, and found it was a hard sell. Hard trying to find a job in Phi Ed was not easy. I ended up working as a special education teacher in the inner city of Milwaukee, working with some really, really tough kids. I kind of found my calling at that point. I was like, wow, I can really relate. I was great at, making relationships with students. That's the direction I ended up going. I ended up getting then a master's degree in special education and continuing and eventually then, working in some public schools in the Milwaukee area and in the state of Wisconsin, and continued for about 20 years, working in special education, working with students with some high behavioral, problems. We got along great. I could easily get them to the finish line. But once they left, it kind of bothered me. They still weren't really prepared for the real world. They didn't have the real world life skills I thought that they needed. So part of my journey, what I did was I connected the students I was working with, to local businesses, different career opportunities, work-based learning, if you would. So I started that process way back in the 90s, in the early 2000s. And I thought, man, this is really cool. And to this day, some of the kids in a community that I worked in, I'll see those kids and they're still in those same careers. A couple of the students I come across. So it's awesome. It's really rewarding. But I eventually then moved into leadership. I got a leadership degree. So here I am, right? Somebody that couldn't connect in high school to the educational process, adding, master's degrees as I go along. So, shifting gears a little bit, went into administration. My first job was an associate principal in a school district here in Wisconsin. And I wasn't really good at it, much more in favor of students and supporting students. I saw that really easy, and supporting educators to be able to have that capacity and skill to be able to deal with, students when they're disengaged or, not connected to their school process. I found it easy, but teachers, they didn't have that skill set right away. So, it was a little bit of oil water at the front end of it. So I shifted gears a little bit and I worked, I got a job then with one of our collaborative agencies here in the state. And I ended up working in that CESA for about 5 years, doing a lot of work with like revisioning special education programs, alternative ed programs. And again, my lens that I came in with was a career community engagement type approach with those types of systems. And it really took off. So it took off in a way that it started to connect in a broader sense and start to support school districts versus just certain programs within a school system. So I bounced around, landed in CESA 2, which is one of our regions in our state. And the work that I've been doing has been, that transformational approach, systems change with school systems, with school districts. And it's just exploded over the last couple of years. Very intrigued and interested with, what is this? So
that's awesome. You said something I want to, before we move into your work at CESA, I wrote it down. You found a way to connect with with students with high behavior problems. And you said you found that work, it kind of came natural to you. For someone who may struggle with working with that audience, who might be working in special education or may just be dealing with some challenging students in the classroom, give me something practical there. Like what's the Scott Carr approach to making that thing work?
Yeah, great question. When I was working with the first CESA organization, I did a lot of behavioral trainings, and I call it, you got to have the it. And people be, well, what's it? And it's like, I don't know. It ends up being, I think, just being very relational, right? People that are compassionate, have empathy and understand what really empathy is versus sympathy, right? There's a big difference there. Being able to, show that type of behavior, payback respect to those that you're working with. I think that's probably the biggest piece. And, you got to build that, and it has to be something that's organic, that you're natural at. I learned it through sports. I recognize that those people that influenced me and guided me the most were my coaches. So I take a coaching approach. What's the end goal that we want? And I really try to connect in a way that helps that student get there, right? And I don't look at them as a student either. I look at them as a person, as a human being, as where do we want to move towards, kind of a thing.
I like that. That's very well said.
It's all relational.
It's all relational. I like that. Me too, coming from, being a football guy in sports. I know I feel like I gained a lot of leadership and how to work in teams and deal with adversity, all that fun stuff from our sports backgrounds, So I'm curious, what are some takeaways from your athlete days that still show up in your leadership style today?
Yeah, great question. It's funny, the durable skills, right? America succeeds. Is that starting to roll forward? I take a peek at it and I'm like, and I do a ton of work with that with the districts I'm working with. And I went around that and I'm like, I wonder how many of these I have, right? But back, I guess probably back to that would be persistency, to your question, passion, right? And it's led me to recognize, to be able to find who I am at my own self, my own purpose. And interestingly, right, I'm at the back end of my career. I'm kind of landing the last 10 years. I've kind of landed in my purpose in my career, which has a lot of relevance in the work that I'm doing. Right? Shouldn't it have happened a lot sooner? Shouldn't it have been at a point in time where I'm in my school system where I find what my purpose is? Yet I'm landing at the back half. But coming out of a sport, I think it disciplines you to be able to be reflective, be able to be, reflective to the degree as to who am I versus worrying about others. And it's just, I think it's also a part of your attributes and who you are as a person. Those are developed in your first 7 years of your life. So it's probably more by my characteristic traits of who I am that has now matched, to me in the work that I'm doing.
I think what you just said is so powerful and in alignment with the way I think about how our education system should prepare our students. It's like we want to, especially when it comes to like CTE and that work, how do we expose a kid to work that they can see themselves in, right? So that you can find yourself in the work. Then things like the persistence, the passion are realized into something that can make economic sense, career, something that can turn into a career. I'm curious in your work, saying that you found that for yourself in the last 10 years as it relates to you working in career, community, and life readiness. How do we help prepare or expose our kids to find themselves in the work early? Yeah,
that's a great question, because as we've seen our systems identify the need to change, we've created a lot of siloing and isolation. There's a lot of great work that's happening, like work-based learning. In our state, we've got what's called academic and career planning. It's some of the best work that has entered into our state. It was back in 2017. It's actually public law that our school systems grades 6 through 12 have to have a program within their school system, right? And we have great leadership at our state level to help support this, but it's done in isolation. It's like an initiative that lands within the school system versus how does this become organic where we live it as a part of our culture. So we'll see a lot of this work taking place, but it's almost hindsight, right? It's when students are exiting where they actually start to identify what their purpose is. So the system itself has to change, right? So, at the root of understanding who you are and what your purpose is, it goes back to identifying, your attributes, right? And like I said before, your attributes are in you. You know them by the age about 7, right? And those don't change. That's your DNA. And we also know that in our educational system, our students will foreclose by the age of 9 or 10, right? So they're already creating a disengagement thought process very early on. So I think systematically to see relevance and to be able to create that purposeful journey for a student at the back end, we got to start at the front end at a very young age to connect our students to who they are at their core with those attributes. And really ideally, and this makes a ton of sense, right? Your attributes naturally match to a career pathway, to a community engagement civic pathway. We often talk about, in the work that I do, we talk about fingertip values. And your fingertip values will also very much match to things you end up wanting to engage in and get involved in. Well, why don't we have that as a part of our process at the front end in our educational system, right? Truly have career community connected type process of learning with the student at the center at the front end. Think of what would happen at the back end. Think of how intentionalized those work-based learning, what I call a transitional phase, at that back end. Can you imagine what that would look like? Right now we know that students that go on to college, they don't make a decision on what they want to become, right? Until a lot of the times into their junior year in college. Let alone, is college really necessary, right? I mean, we're seeing a ton of information around that right now, which is very relevant to our systematic change too.
Yeah, talk to me more about the figurative. You said figurative values. Is that what you just said?
Fingertip. So like
fingertip.
Yeah,
fingertip value. How can we how do you see that moving? What's that look like if you move it to the front end?
Yeah, a great question. Well, in some of the frameworks that I've pulled together, right? So we look at the front end, what we want to do is find a career, community, and life identity for our students at a young age, right? So that process includes, asking the right questions, but also getting to know our students. Goes back to that special education process and the relational piece, right? Is that fingertip values tend to be, what are your intellectual, what draws you intellectually? What draws you emotionally, right? We often don't talk about those types of things with students, or even let alone letting them figure out what those are within themselves. Because like I said, before, part of that awareness process and becoming aware of yourself allows you to move in then to the next phase, which is that connectedness. And there's basically 4 phases that are part of the framework. It's awareness, connectedness, exploration, and then transition. And a lot of the times, those 4 phases are usually a part of an educational system. But what we're seeing, where we're seeing that land tends to be like that sophomore, junior, senior year. You can't transition through those 4 components, those 4 areas in an organic way, but also in a student-centered, where they have agency type way in that short of a period. So knowing all that information about yourself at the front end, which we call those fingertip values, in aligning.
Is that something you can't, that term, is that something you all created, this fingertip values?
I can't say that I maybe invented it myself, but I probably heard it somewhere. That's kind of that evolution.
Okay.
I mean, you've written books and you've done this work. I mean,
yeah. Because I just looked at, I was, when you said it, I was like, I've never heard this. So I just looked it up. I couldn't find anything. I was like, okay. I like it. I like it. Fingertip values. So I'm sorry. Keep going. I cut you.
It's part of a systematic change, if I would, systematic process change which is very delicate, right? Can you imagine, pulling together a group of first, second, third grade teachers, whatever, and say, hey, we're going to do this now. Right? You're going to be expected to pull, to get to know your students at this level and connect this information about your students, to career, community, life readiness. When we take it in an approach systematically, where we look at shifting mindsets at the beginning stages and transforming and taking our time doing it, what ends up happening is when you have that information, you can ask this question, which I think is really vital, and it really sparks the interest of teachers when we get to the level of working with teachers. It's this, after you identify what a career identity is for a kid, right? Which is, I put that on the group of teachers we're working with. It's like, what would that mean to you? And I don't come in with a definition. I say, let's define it ourselves. And we move to what's a community identity and then a life identity. Once we know that, we ask the question, if you knew the career identity of every kid in front of you, how would your classroom look different? How would you plan differently? What could you do differently so every kid moving forward from that point on would understand their purpose, could align their priorities, and could then set a plan for themselves over the next, what I say, like 13 to 14 years. And when you ask that question to educators around this transformation, obviously it starts first up with the administration team level, right? Because you just can't walk into teachers and have this kind of conversation. Right. But when you get to that level of asking that question, the inspiration, the eyes light up, and teachers, they kind of revitalize themselves and go, wow, this makes a lot of sense. When you get to the practical, putting it together in a classroom, it goes back to getting very difficult, though. I'll be real honest.
It's interesting, man. For perspective, Scott, you're working in CESA too. Like, how many schools or educators are you working with as it relates to your career, community, and life readiness work?
Yeah, that's a good question. Right now, I'm invested in about 8 schools.
Okay.
A couple of them are even what you'd call maybe non-traditional schools. So an alternative ed school I'm working with. Okay. Of about 200 kids. So that's going to be a great experience. I'm working with a special education only type school system, which is going to be another, kind of another challenge. But that equity in access is a big component of it. But there's a lot. I get a ton of schools that reach out and say, what is this? How do we move this way? And generally what happens is they reflect around it and come back with, we're just not quite ready to dive all the way in. There's a handful of schools that I've been working with over the last couple of years that are doing some really, some great transitional work, around this career, what do you call career, community, life readiness type focus within their school system.
What does dive all the way in? What's that look like?
That'd be that, first of all, the change of mindsets up front. We've attempted to do this in the educational system around numerous things. I mean, we've been looking at student engagement, which is really the number one driving pain point around the need to move, right? The statistics and what we're seeing, and we're seeing upwards of 25% of our students in classrooms are actively disengaged, right? I mean, that's not even just being not paying attention. That means I'm doing something different. I would say diving all the way in looks like where you're changing mindsets, you're creating innovation and the inspiration to want to innovate out of the teachers in the classroom. And then they become the entrepreneurs of this new work within their school system, right? I mean, we know, I think Justin Wright hits it very, very well as he talked about, right, in his book, that the best work, the greatest work that takes place in our educational systems are by great teachers kind of behind closed doors. We don't even know what's happening. And a lot of the times it doesn't align even to what our initiatives are. So to dive all the way in, you first have to tackle changing mindsets. And you have to get to a point of where you have a group of leaders that is not just your district office team, right? That can answer this question. It's, what's the fundamental purpose of an educational system? Like, what is our why? Why do we exist? And, we've come to this point in time through evolution that our focus has been really achievement based. Our state report cards are all, representing that. It's all, academics, standardized testing, and we're getting graded on that. But ultimately, when you answer the question, what's our fundamental purpose? We basically come back to, it's career preparation for every kid. So if a kid walked out of your school prepared for a career, they're probably also ready to and could continue their education too, right? They probably, if they're career ready, they're probably able to be, could function in a community, could understand their civic engagement in what they should support in that respect. And so that's the front end that has to happen, that change in mindsets, change in culture.
You just laid a lot on us right there, Scott.
It's hard work, man.
You just laid a lot on us. Are you working with a specific part of education, like area? Are you working with math teachers, science teachers, CTE, or like does it vary? That's a great question. Like in a couple of the districts that we're out in front with some of this work at the beginning stages, we ask that question, right? And to get that what I call emotional investment out of the team up front is to ask the question this too. I love, and I've done this with some students, a lot of students. So if you can picture, we're in a meeting at the leadership level, right? They're scratching their head saying, do we want to do this work? And the question ends up being, well, if we pull a kid out of 10th grade algebra class, and we ask them this question, what would be the response? We ask the kid, what's your purpose? And if a kid can't answer that question with the vision of what you represent as a school district, like it doesn't go back to your mission, it doesn't go back to your strategic plan, which rarely, I've never even come across a kid that can articulate it that way, which might be the extreme, right? I haven't had kids even answer, I'm in school because I want to end up doing this. Generally, the answer to it, I'm taking this class, because I need the credit, that kind of stuff. So we start there, move towards a direction of really reshaping the what I call strategic priorities within a school. And then we move to what we call a readiness team, which is only educators. And that readiness team is made up of numerous different educators within the school system. So it could be a high school team, it could be a school-wide team, it could be a middle school team. Those individuals are the ones that move the work forward. They're the ones that actually go through the same kind of a process, right? They kind of revitalize themselves, they regenerate, they reimagine, and they take the most simplest form of priorities that generally are shaped around career, community, life readiness, and they figure out how to implement that in their classrooms. And that process is done through a very strategic approach, which is a piloted team, very slow approach, constantly going back to the why, giving a little bit of the training, and then constantly looking at, that workshop model of them moving the work forward. So it could include any kind of a teacher. We want the ones that want to experiment. We want those that are willing to take risks. I love it. It's important to have that open mind. I'm curious to reach this level of cultural change within an education system or a district, it's a lot of shifting mindsets. So I'm curious, what are some strategies that you use that are working to reimagine and to shift mindsets?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, one, how would I say it? You have to layer it the right way, right? So typically my work has really, like I said, snowballs, kind of exploded. So it looks like this, word of mouth. All of a sudden I'll get an email from maybe a building principal, sometimes even a superintendent, and they'll say, what's this about? So that entry level conversation is really vital. And once I'm in the door and we start that work with what I call that strategic team, I use a ton of some of your podcast videos, to be quite honest, Sylvester, right? I mean, some of the stuff Kevin Fleming has said is outstanding, right?
Yeah, absolutely. He's a rock star.
He totally is, right? I mean, funny thing too with him, I didn't know that was Kevin, on those videos. And then when I met Kevin, I'm like, man, your voice sounds familiar. I'm like,
Yep.
But yeah, I use strategically, I would say you have to go through the why before you can move to the what and the how, right? And so I help a district. I think one of the best things that I've kind of stumbled across is this. I pair up the why with what I call retreat style type professional development. And then I pair up the what with what I call training, right, type professional development. And then I pair up the how we do this with what I call workshop type professional development. And there's a time and place for each one of those. But a great team has to behave their way towards a change in culture. And through that process, they have to understand, when do I lean on what piece of this? In our educational system, historically, we've done a ton of the work around the what. And it always comes in this training type concept, right? PLC is a great example of this, right? PLC would have entered so much more smoothly, and we would be, because it's great work, don't get me wrong, right? Mm-hmm. But a lot of schools have entered PLC at the level of the what. They come in with this training process, right? And in a collaborative way, a lot of the times our leadership teams feel they're being highly collaborative. But a lot of the times those educators that are in on the strategic team level tend to be a lot of times those that they select. It's not a lot of the times those that are the great teachers behind closed doors doing all that, all that work on their own. But then we move towards, even as a leadership team level, we move to the how, and we tell people how to do it. Whereas strategically, I think the best piece of advice would be to take your time to get through that process and really have the leadership transformational behaviors, I call it, to be able to hand that work off in that workshop style to those that are doing the work. And I'll tell you, Sylvester, probably the best experiences and the best mentoring and coaching that I've done has been to help leaders, administrators, learn how to say things like, I don't know. When asked, how do we do this? What do you want us to do? To respond with, I don't know, but I'm sure you'll figure it out. What a great problem to have. Let's tackle this together. A lot of the times when leaders are asked, how do we do this? It's almost like, yeah, I got that question. Now I can jump in and tell everyone how to do it. And so what does that do? It turns into hoop jumping, right? And that's, you get people then following a responsibility versus looking at opportunity and doing things that they want to do.
I like how you frame that. And then I feel like it also creates more buy-in for the team. Like when you are, just going through like some things like strategic planning initiatives, or if you're trying to make those cultural changes within the organization, it's nice if we all co-create said solution, and it's not just like one person, 2-3 people, the leaders, and telling everyone this is how it's going to go.
You're exactly right. I think some of the most exciting work that I've been doing is watching leadership skills start to evolve with the readiness team members.
Okay, talk to me more about that.
Well, So the readiness team, right, they're the doers. They're the ones that you create the workshops for and allow them to create what I call the strategic plan, right? I think they're the ones that should be creating our strategic plans in our school systems, the doers, right?
Yes.
And so when you represent the expectation that, hey, like I said before, if you're a great leader and you can feel comfortable with saying, I don't know, right, to a group like that, but I'm sure you guys will figure it out. How can we get there together? You're actually moving leadership onto them, right? That's that transformational leadership that's really important. When teachers become those leaders, now we have momentum, right? Now we've got, what'll end up happening is that you'll see cognitive investment, right? That's the rationale. This is some great work out of Anthony Muhammad and Luis Cruz, right? Time for change. It's that cognitive investment will move when you know the rationale, when it's understood through the why. Now you're able to move towards that emotional investment. That's the believe in. And when you have that believe in, right, now you can bleed into the broader, school itself. That's why we do it through a piloted approach, because I call it a bleeding system. At one point, what we're going to do with you on the readiness team, you're going to invite a friend in, right? You're going to invite a friend in. You're going to help them do what you've just done over the last 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 2 months, whatever it took us. You're going to pull somebody else in. And a lot of the times with some leadership and some administration teams, I have to say, keep your hands off this. Let this naturally take place. It goes right back to, like I said before, with Justin Reich's, iteration work. It's that experimental phase. When teachers can get out and be innovative and experiment without threat, great work is going to take off. And so part of my role, and I think where I've been of value to schools, is that I'm the guy that comes in, right? Think of my history here. Bottom 50% of graduating out of high school, non-traditional. I understand what it means to be disconnected, and I'm helping build the opportunity for those that are going to do the work, that confidence that they can go explore.
Yeah.
Right? Now great things are going to happen.
I love that. I think that's so entrepreneurial in its approach, in the sense of you have direct knowledge of the problem and you experienced it. And so now you are in a phenomenal position through all of your training and education and experience to lead the teams, lead the charge, lead the work to make that shift and that change. One of the things you were telling me about in our earlier conversations before we started recording, the future is CCLR. The future is clear. Your big conference that you're working on. Tell me about what you're working on to help expand this work even further.
Yeah. Thanks for allowing me to give a little plug, I guess. But the work has exploded. Like I said, CESA 2 is a great organization. They've kind of inspired me to start to pull some of these frameworks together. As you know, when ideas start to show themselves, you want to capture it, try to figure out how can we benefit, more people around this type of work. So they've kind of inspired me to kind of pull it together in a writing format in a way. So I'm starting to plot all this stuff out. And then we thought, what if we did a year-long conference series? What if we did, because that's what it's about, right? And a lot of conferences we go to are somewhat of a 3-day, 4-day, 2-day, and you learn this information and you walk away and you scratch your head, how do we implement? You get excited up front. What we want to do is a year-long process of this. We're looking at the front end, doing some webcasts, right? Got the idea inspired by, yourself, Sylvester. I really appreciate it. But it's like, that's, there's high impact around a conversation that can last for about a half an hour, sparking the ideas. So we want to do some seed planners of podcasts, right? Webcast, and that from about August to about February of this next school year here. And then we want to do a conference in April of 2025, a 3-day conference where at the front end of the conference is going to be about shifting mindsets, systems change. How does that look? We've got some really key people, on the docket that are going to come in that have done this work from outside of our state. Day 2, we want to talk about, the work around, equity and access. This is for all, right? Because gaps are created when it's just siloed. And then also, how do you measure it? What does that look like? And really move into that competency-based concept and measuring it. And then slowly move into the connectedness to your community. Because day 3, what we want to do with school districts is have them bring their business partners to the day. And so, that'll be a great opportunity to connect. And then in August of 2025, we're looking at doing a symposium where we have kind of like that invite only, where maybe we're looking at if we can get, somewhere between 20, 25 school districts to come back to the table and start to talk about what does this look like in a transformational sense for you for the next school year. And we're anticipating we're going to have some schools that are already in that process doing great work that can lend to be, those that help mentor. But really just trying to help move this work forward within our state over a year-long process is kind of the goal there, right? It's a mountain to climb to get this all pulled together. But, I think it'll be a great thing, once we get her all organized.
I love it, man. I think it's, when you told me about it, I was excited about it. I think it's an innovative approach, not just a one and done 1 day or 2 day situation, but expanding it out to really add the most value and the impact so people can really walk away with the learning, with the resources, with the tools and the knowledge to create that future that is clear. Yeah. So that's outstanding. You just mentioned it as it's connected to like day 3 of your conference. I was going to ask you, how do you measure success when you're doing this work?
Yeah, that's a great question. It'd be great to try to figure out some type of a measuring system for students once they've walked out the door. I mean, ideally, I think that's the ultimate. But to a certain degree, I look at it as, what has a kid compiled over 12 years, 13 years? And we need to, that's part of the framework that I pull together and work with. It ends up being part of the learner process. It's that portfolio type concept. I think we're going to see ourselves move away from resumes. And I honestly feel we're going to see ourselves moving away from almost a career pathway connection into a more of a match of what your durable skills, what your skills and attributes are to be able to go out and do multiple things. So I guess it would be, what does that look like? What is a student compiled through the process of that journey? Because graduation isn't an end. It is just part of the transition into adulthood in a way, maybe. And so what have you compiled? Let's take a look at that. And if we don't have a lot of wows going on, like, wow, that's some great stuff. If kids aren't seeing that themselves, being self-guided learners themselves, right? Having that agency, being able to want to present that to you. Right? I think that's the evidence that we need to start to see.
I like that. I like that, what you're saying. And that really moves into that, like that competency-based kind of framework and really pulling out those skills. That's one of the things as we went through our curriculum, kind of some revisions with like our entrepreneurship curriculum. It's about pulling out those skills, documenting it so that a student we can see that verifiable work, the things that they've created, and then even taking it a step further and thinking about badging or offering credentials connected to it. I really feel like that's the future. We've had so many guests on that are talking about that work. I'm really feeling like that's what the future is going to look like. And I love that you're on top of it, Scott.
Yeah, I definitely agree, right? And to what degree do we bring our students to the table and say, hey, what do you want it to look like? Right? I think that's probably a big key. I mean, I think there's like a couple of really big keys in this work. And at the front end, we tend to skip over this because even at the back end, if we're doing some of this work, but our students don't know their purpose, they don't know who they are at their core, it's still going to be misaligned, right? So the front end work has to come first. And it's right now, we've done a lot of the back end work, But the front end work at the young age of this awareness and connectedness is probably the most vital. The other thing I would say is this: if you want really transformation to happen as a leadership team, you have to respect what I call a responsibility versus opportunity. I call it, it's a T chart. And what I've done with some school districts is that when we get together as a leadership team, I say, write down everything you're going to or you have asked your teachers to do, right, in a given year. Like, those are all initiatives, right? And then we put them up on, on a board, we project it, and I'll say, okay, being a teacher, out of the list of things that you've listed here, which of these do you think that they'll look at and say, these are responsibilities, that inward leadership thinking, right? That closed mindset thinking, because what they are things they have to do. And then on the other side, I put the word up, opportunities. Those are all experiences. Those are things that's the outward leadership, right? That's that adaptive approach versus technical approach. And that's where you get your investment, that cognitive investment leading to emotional investment out of your educators. And when we go through that process, it's very interesting. There's a lot of administrators that want to move a lot of the things that they're asking teachers to do onto that right-hand side of opportunity. And by the end of the day, we're talking about, no, they end up on the left-hand side. Yeah. So if you can't do that reflective process and look at, what should our priorities really be? And I'm not saying that PLC is something you shouldn't do. It's how you get to it is really the key piece. Because in that same theory that I just said to you, I ask our readiness team, the teachers that are doing the work, to do the same exact activity, but I do it with, put your students in the thinking of your students. What would they look at as responsibility versus opportunity? And what you're asking them to do in a classroom, right? Because the same concept then overlaps itself in a classroom. Kids jumping through hoops, right? Because it's a responsibility that they have to do. How do you shift and move the things you're doing into an opportunity within your classroom that comes through experiences? So that when you start talking that, you see the shift in thinking of leaders on, wow, that's interesting. How do we get there? Is really
100%.
Yeah,
100%, Scott. I think you really have me. I'm walking away from this conversation thinking a lot about how we need to lift up the why and the empathy a lot more on the front end. Like, what's the purpose of this? I am in school for what? I'm taking this class for what, beyond just the credit or the letter grade, but making sure we're making that deeper connection. I thank you for lifting that up. I know that's going to be a big talking point. My final question for you, I ask every guest is, what's your vision for the future of career tech education?
Yeah, that's a great question. As you know, I've heard that question many times. I listened to a lot of the people on your podcast, and I've kind of chewed on this, right, a little bit. I think it's what I'd love to see is a shift from our current educational system, the current process, into a true educational community ecosystem where we truly have the student at the center versus the school at the center, right? Currently we function with school at the center with all these spokes that come out like a wagon wheel with all these different things. And that creates such gaps for our students. So I would say a true educational community ecosystem where, that career community, life readiness is immersed in every classroom, right? You're seeing that work blend itself. It's not an additional class. It's in all the pieces of work that our educators do, that we allow for our educators to be innovators, right? Entrepreneurs of their own classroom, their own departments, their own schools. We back off and let them create the strategic plans versus us at that highest level creating them. And we see a true transformation of the system, which allows agency for our students, the ability for our students to own their journey and truly at the heart of this concept, they become lifelong learners, right? Because I've been a lifelong learner, and I finally realized at the end of my journey. Whereas I wish I would have known that up front. So our system has to change to create, really what that would be. So it's exciting work. I think I'll probably be retired. I might be long gone before we see this shift. But I mean, I'm working hard at trying to see it happen.
Absolutely, Scott. Thank you so much for sharing so many gems, so many great pieces of knowledge. You really are shifting some mindsets. I can see your passion and intention for the work that you're doing. If anyone wants to reach out to you to learn more, or even to learn about this conference that you're building out, where do you want to point them?
Yeah, they can go to our CESA website, and that's CESA number 2. Just Google that. You'll find it. Google my name, Scott Carr, or you can reach me at scott.carr@cesa2.org. Feel free to email me. I love connecting, as you know, right? And so, yeah. Appreciate all you do, Sylvester. Appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, Scott. Thank you. I'm glad that we were able to connect and really go deep on this conversation. To all our listeners, if you enjoyed this conversation, do not be selfish. Share it with a friend who needs to hear this. Share it with a colleague who may be working on some of these problems that Scott addressed. Until the next episode, remember, you don't have to be great to get started, but you have to get started to be great. Peace.
Thank you for listening to the Global CTE Podcast. Be sure to like and subscribe to be the first to know about future episodes.